Hey, good morning, everybody. How's it going? I'm Ian Douglas. I'm the author of this website, Tech Interview Guide. And today we've got a guest with us today. We've got Jibran with us today from coming from Dubai, right? That's right.
Yep.
Over
Yeah.
in the
Right.
UAE. And Jibran is a senior developer at Stripe and agreed to come hang out with us for a little bit and chat about like what makes you stand out as an interview candidate and talk about their technical background, how they get a job at a big company like Stripe, and some of the interesting stuff that has gone on in his career. So appreciate your time, Jibran. Thank you for spending some time with us today. Westery, good to see you in chat as well as a handful of other viewers. Feel free to drop a hello in chat. Let us know where you're from. If you're watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, all that stuff. Leave comments, and yeah. So Jibran, let's dive right in. Let's talk a little bit about your history. You've been in the tech industry for quite a while. Looks like you've been doing this for a hot minute, same as me.
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit about how you got started in the tech industry and like how that led into the kinds of software and programming and stuff that you enjoy doing.
Sure. Uh, right. First of all, thanks for having me. Yeah. Pleasure to be here. So, so I've been a professional software developer for almost, I'd say, 10 years now. But wo- I've been building software for almost 15. And I think, so I'm a self-taught software developer as well. So that's one thing that sort of adds context to all of the discussion
Awesome.
we'll have moving forward. My first professional job as a software developer was interestingly also in Dubai. I'm originally from Pakistan, but I moved to Dubai in 2013, somewhere around there. And honestly, it was, I think, mostly luck that got me my first position. Uh, I say luck because a recruiter at a fairly large startup here in Dubai reached out to me. The startup is called Dubizzle. They're still around. Uh, and at that time, I think when I joined, their team had 50-ish engineers or a bit more. So for me, it was, and in my career, that's been sort of the biggest startup that I've been at, except for Stripe. And so the reason they reached out is they looked at a couple of GitHub repositories that I had shared, I had
Cool.
made public, and so they liked what my work over there, and then they sort of reached out, and we went through the interview process and all of that. So yeah, I'd say honestly, the first job I had was purely because I had put something out there and then got lucky that someone discovered it.
What kinds of projects did you have on GitHub that they found?
I'm I don't remember honestly, but I think I can actually share my GitHub link as well if that would be interesting for
Yeah,
people
sure.
in the chat.
Sounds good. Oh, I think we lost your audio here. Yeah, it looks like we lost your
I'll
audio.
actually
There we go.
okay. I'll share it with you. I can't seem to
Okay, no
put
problem.
it in Stripe, and then maybe I can share it with the viewers. But yeah, it was mostly small hobby projects that I had made. For instance, one of the things I really like doing whenever I'm learning a new language is implement Conway's Game of Life.
Oh yeah.
That's a small cellular
Mm-hmm.
automata thing.
Good stuff.
So that's something like to implement, and it usually gets you going in a new language pretty quickly, and has some interesting challenges that you need to be aware of when you're implementing that. So I think that would have been one, and then a few others would be the small utilities that I had made in Python, a couple of scripts, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but there wasn't any systematic way in which I was building the projects that I was making public. And if I were to do that today, if I was to build up a profile for myself today, or if I were to advise, let's say, a friend who's just learning to program, I would probably give them a list of things to build and then make public, which I believe would better serve them in their job search.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, Conway's Game of Life is really interesting. I recently shared a story on the stream about how when I was a software teacher, we had the students actually work through like what was Conway's Game of Life and how do you think you would program it, and you know we had several rounds where the first one's like just go read about it, imagine what you would do, write out some notes, and the second one's like okay, let's actually write out some pseudocode, and then the third round was let's actually write the code. And we had one student like nah, and they kind of noped out of it for the day, and then they were getting ready for a technical interview. They went to the technical interview and they asked them, hey, can you implement Conway's Game of Life at the interview? And they're like, I've never done this before. It's like should have done your work at school. And then came back and like actually like was humble enough to like in front of all the other students like, hey, this person just got a job, like tell us about your job interview. And they're like, well, they asked me about that Conway's Game of Life that I decided not to do on that one community day. So yeah, if your instructors tell you to do a thing, we've got a reason for it.
But that also, it tells me that might have been a pretty nice company that asks about Conway's Game of Life in an interview and stays away from all of the lead code style interviews.
This is true. This is true. Yeah, like I had an interview back in January, which, like I always dreaded interviewing as well, leak code style things. It's like I'll puzzle my way through it, sure, what the heck, studied up on the algorithms and all this stuff. And I get to the interview and they're like, so part of what we build is a dashboard for, reaching out to a back end service and collecting statistics and whatever. So we want you to write some Python code that's going to go hit this endpoint, get some JSON data, and calculate some statistics to pass on to another thing. And I'm like, okay. And in my mind, I'm like, this is exactly what the job is. This is exactly what the interview should be. Like, demonstrate what you're going to do on a day-to-day basis. And so I was going through and writing out the Python. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to use the request library if that's cool. They're like, yep, that's fine. And so I'm like, I'm just going to assume happy path. Like in a production system, I would be catching exceptions and I would be looking for error status so I can make sure my user gets a good experience. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to assume all this is going to work just to get the groundwork going. They're like, all right, perfect. That's great. And at the end of it, they're like, that's exactly what we wanted to see a candidate do. Like, don't spend time going through exception handling and all the error things. Like, just assume it's going to work. And it was such a great interview experience. But it was around the same time that I decided I didn't want to be a developer. I wanted to focus more on the developer advocate type of role. So I decided not to keep moving forward. But I was actually getting ready to interview at Stripe. I actually applied for a job there, and they reached out, and they were talking about their interview process. But by then, I already had a handful of offers, and I'm like, I'm not gonna bother. So I just withdrew at that point. But so you get those first couple of jobs, and just kind of looking through your job history on LinkedIn, that led to a lot of really interesting jobs. A lot of your jobs were like year and a half, 1 year, year and a half, year and a bit, and then 4 years. And then now you've been at Stripe for coming up on a year. So tell us a little bit about what it was like, in different regions of the world. Like, do you feel like the interview process is still kind of the same, from country to country and company to company? Like, have you experienced the same kinds of interviews along the way?
I mean, I can't speak very broadly about that because most of my interviews have been in the UAE
Mm-hmm.
because, but a few years ago I did try interviewing in a couple of other countries as well. Last year, when I was when I decided to move to Stripe, I also interviewed in a couple of other companies in some in Europe uh, and some in the UK. And I think all of the interview processes for companies that sort of just don't think about it much are the same. Uh, they just sort of cargo cult it. They figure if Google is doing, let's say, lead code style interviews, then we should do lead code style interviews, and
Yeah.
that's I think something that holds broadly across the world. I've seen that in a bunch of interviews I've done here in the UAE as well, and a few that I've done in companies outside of the
Yeah.
UAE. What I feel a really good companies do is exactly what you've just sort of mentioned. Your experiences, they look at what your job is going to be, or roughly what your job is going to be, even if they don't know where exactly you're going to fit. They still know what kind of applications you'll be working on, and then they interview based on those. And I think those are the really good companies to. At least that's a very good signal. That's a very strong signal for a company that really thinks about the interview process. Uh, because honestly, it's. I mean, as a self-taught developer, that's been one of the biggest. I think I'd say I wouldn't say shortcomings, but still something that really.
Oh, looks like we lost Jibran. We'll wait for Jibran to come back. If you do have questions for myself or Jibran, feel free to drop those in chat. I'm going to see if we can get reconnected here. We'll wait for him to rejoin, and then I'll get him back in OBS. So if you've got questions along the way, feel free to drop those in chat. So we're chatting with Jibran. He's a senior developer at Stripe, and he's over in Dubai where it's like 9 p.m. right now. So I really appreciate Jibran's time. I can hear some family involvement going on in the background too. So I appreciate time away from family to have a chat with us today. So we'll give him a couple of minutes to rejoin, and then we'll carry on from there. Meanwhile, I got the Diversity in Tech fundraiser going here. I'm going to get that stuff updated here while we're waiting for Jibran to come back. And also while we wait, want to let everybody know that the new mailing list setup is all installed and working. So if you want to subscribe to the new mailing list, or the new newsletters, actually, you can go see that link over in chat. The daily email series, the sign up over there now is going to, when you subscribe, it will allow you to, it'll send you an email. And when you click on that email, then it's going to give you a list of like, these are all the newsletters that you can subscribe to. And then you just enable a checkbox saying, I want this one. And then you can set the pace of how frequently you want to get those messages, and then the date you want the messages to start. And then it'll send you an initial one right away saying like, hey, thanks for subscribing. You'll get that within 5-10 minutes. And then after that, you'll get one at about 7 a.m. Pacific every day. Or whenever, like, depending on the pace that you set. So if you want them every day, you'll get one every day from each of the newsletters that you subscribe to. But you can set that pace individually for each of the newsletters. So right now, the technical and behavioral ones are launched, and the general tips one is launched. There's only about a dozen questions or so on the general list right now, and I'll be working to get more content in there on that one. And then we'll also have more of the preparation stuff done in a little bit. All right, looks like Jibran's back, so I'm going to take a moment here and get them back on the call. So just bear with me a moment while we get that going. All right, let's see if we can get Jibran back here. Not yet. All right, so we'll give Jibran another moment or two, and then we'll go from there. So in the meantime, if you have questions for chat, feel free to drop those in chat. If you want to ask something anonymously, you can ask anonymously. Just send a whisper over to the bot, and that'll show up as an anonymous question. You're welcome to send that over. There's Jibran. Hey, welcome back.
I apologize for that. I think
no worries.
Connection.
Yeah, not a problem at all.
I'm not sure where you lost me.
So we were talking about, like, just broadly speaking, is the interview process the same, or is it has it improved over time? Like, what kinds of differences, I guess, have you seen in the interview process? And you were talking about how companies watch other companies and they do what they do. And I was going to comment how FANG companies were the ones that really started with the leak code style problems, and everybody's like, yeah, let's start with those. Actually, back in I guess before you got your career started, back in like 2005, 2006, when Google started, they were asking a lot of like brain teaser questions, like how many golf balls fit in a school bus, and everybody started asking those questions, thinking that that was some brilliant way to interview people. And then in
Yeah.
2009, Google published an article going, "Yeah, we didn't learn very much. Those questions are dumb." And everyone else was like, "Yeah, those questions are dumb." And they like everybody stopped asking those questions, and it turned into the leak code style. And what was interesting was it last year or the year before? I think it was last year, last summer, I think Amazon declared like we're not going to ask dynamic programming problems anymore, and then Facebook announced in the fall that they weren't going to ask dynamic programming problems anymore. And I'm curious to hear from people now, like, do you get dynamic programming problems in interviews, or is everybody else kind of following suit, going, yeah, dynamic programming problems aren't helpful because everybody approaches them the exact same way of bottom up recursion with caching. It's like there's nothing new in thinking about dynamic programming problems. So it'll be interesting to see how that propagates out now, and then whether these other companies pick up on like what is a better practice, and watch that then spread around other companies as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, totally agreed. It's sad, I'd say, or at least a bit annoying that people just copy, companies just sort of copy what larger companies are doing, because I read an article a couple of months ago. I don't have a link to it anymore, but it sort of argued that these lead code style interviews, they make sense for places like Google that have attritions where they have to hire tens of thousands of software developers a year, right? And when you need to hire that many people, you need a process that you can quickly go through and just sort of rank people on whether they're
Right.
a programmer that can work at Google or not. But when you're a small startup and you're hiring your first engineer or even a fifth engineer, right, it doesn't matter as much if they can choose the right algorithm. I'd say it matters a lot more if they can build good products, which is different from choosing the right algorithm. Plus, also, I don't think in my career I've had to use any of the data structures that all of these questions have asked for, except maybe once, and even then I could look it up on the internet.
Exactly. I joke with people too. Sorry to interrupt. I joke with people too. It's like over 26 years in the industry, I've written recursion twice in production.
Yeah.
But we do it all the time in interviews. It's like, why is that?
Yeah, it's just a very somehow we've come to the conclusion as an industry that these are the kind of problems that show you how good a software developer is, which would be the case if this is what software developers needed to do. And there are some jobs in which you do need software developers to build or to write algorithms that are just blazingly fast. But one of my jokes has been in my career, most startups are just a fancy HTML view on top of a database. They're mostly CRUD applications, and you don't really need much for that.
Yep, this is true. I noticed in kind of your work history, you started way back in the day on like Python and Django, and I think I saw like Twitter Bootstrap in your tech stack. I'm like, oh, I remember Bootstrap when that came out. That was great technology back then. Now and it progresses. Like how many CSS libraries have we seen since then? And now I think the latest hotness is what, Tailwind or something. It's like it's always changing.
Yeah.
We're always going to see something new coming in. Absinthe says in chat, this is a great point. The leak code grind reminds me a lot of the MCSE and similar certification farms back in the 90s. How many MCSEs were there and couldn't didn't know how to fix a user login? That's true. You go get all those certifications and like, was it really applicable to what you're doing, on the job? That's a great point. It's a great point for sure. Awesome. Cool. Well, let's chat a little bit then. So you've been at Stripe now for about 9 months, 10 months. Can you talk a little bit about what your job hunt was like last year when you were looking for a job? Like what did that process look like? Did you interview at a bunch of companies, or did you target fewer companies? Like talk us through a little bit about what your job hunt was like.
Sure. Yeah. So I think again, a lot of my career comes down to luck. I wasn't even considering Stripe when I was starting my job hunt. because I was mostly looking for roles in either Netherlands or UK or the island. Because I was sort of at a point in my career where I thought 9 years in UAE, Dubai, uh, were enough for now, and I wanted to sort of move to a different place in the world. And but again, luckily, Stripe had opened an office in Dubai, essentially uh, just like a year ago, or a bit longer than that, but yeah. And I was one of the first few engineers that they were hiring for. I mean, it was uh, probably one of the first positions they had opened that office, and so the timing just sort of matched up there. In terms of how the interviews went, I did interview in a couple of places. Uh, some really good ones in the Netherlands. Some pretty good one pretty good organization in the UK as well. And I had a few options at the end to decide, along with Stripe. And while I really did want to uh, essentially move away from Dubai for now, uh, I think for me the decision came down to just the fact that uh, the kind of learnings I could have at an organization, uh, the size and scale of Stripe, and the kind of impact I could have there would not be matched anyplace else. And so that's kind of, yeah, uh, that's kind of a brief overview of the journey.
Yeah. So it sounds like your typical interview process is a lot like mine, where you pick fewer companies to interview with, and then you get one of those jobs. This past job hunt for me was the first time I'm like, let's go interview with a bunch of companies. I ended up interviewing with like 30 different companies, and I'm like, that's too many. I don't think I would do that
Yeah,
again.
no, yes. I mean, for me, it's I want to be a bit selective about where I work, and so that's how I sort of picked and choose the places that I would interview at,
Gotcha.
and then uh, yeah.
Yep. Cool. We had a question come in from E Garcia GA. If that's Eric Garcia, good to have you in chat. Asked a question: is Stripe or your team considering any entry level engineers? And are bachelor degrees mandatory at Stripe?
Uh, I can't. I don't know the answer to that. But again, Stripe is a huge organization, so uh, they might be hiring entry level people in
Yeah. But
many
you
places, parts of
yourself,
the world.
yeah, you yourself, you don't have a bachelor's degree. Is that right? Like you don't have a
I
degree?
don't have. Yeah,
Yep.
that was
Yep.
my. Yeah, I don't have a bachelor's degree in computer engineering. I still have one in electrical, but I don't think that counts much. And I don't believe I've ever been asked about my degree uh, in any place that I've interviewed at. So I think so that is one of the uh, challenges with the first job, right? Like you, if you have a degree that sort of counts for something when you're applying for your first job, and the way I sort of worked around it is by having projects that are built in the open, right? And that sort of it's not equivalent to a degree, but it shows that you have the skills that someone is looking for, and that is though one of the challenge. And I've also seen it from the other side, right? Like I used to interview people in the previous companies that I worked at the startup that I was at for 4 years, and then a couple of startups before that as well. And when someone is looking at your resume or your CV, what they're essentially trying to answer is, would this person be a good fit for this position? Because it's not just you that's part of the interview. The interviewer, the person that's interviewing you, right? They're also on the line for this, in the sense that if they say you're a good
Mm.
fit for this position and then it turns out that you're not, that leaves an impact on your reputation as a person to as an interviewer, right?
That's a good point.
And
Yeah.
so you, you need to sort of give them signals uh, that can make them comfortable enough uh, with essentially giving you a chance.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, that's interesting to think about. Like it's kind of on, like the interviewing team and their interviewing process of did they find a good candidate,
Yeah,
and if they get all the way through the interview process and they get hired and then they turn out not to be a good candidate, a lot of times engineering management and myself included, we would actually have a retrospective on like what happened, like how did we
yeah,
hire that person, like what happened along the way where we ended up spending the money to bring this person on the team and then it didn't work out. Like could we have caught that at any point during the
yeah,
interview process to sort of disqualify them along the way? And
yeah,
it's a tough one. It's a tough one because some people are really good at interviewing and then get on the
yeah,
job and they're just horrible at the job. Like yeah, and honestly, I think of people that they grind on leak code and they grind on leak code. They do hundreds and hundreds of leak code problems, and they get to the job, and they don't know how to like use the request library to actually go fetch JSON data and like calculate statistics and whatever. Like they don't know how to do that, but they'll code the heck out of a depth first search and a breadth first search and
yeah,
heap algorithms and whatever. It's like, but we don't actually use those on the job. But like you got through the interview, and that's why I think there's such a big mismatch, and why frankly I think a lot of companies need to stop asking leak code style questions and focus more on like what are the actual day-to-day skills that you're going to use. Like if you're doing web development, show us that you can do web development. If you're going to be building CRUD apps, show us that you can build a CRUD app. And there are companies out there, especially for entry level devs, that will say like, here's a take home assignment. Go build us a CRUD app to show us that you can do that, and then we'll consider that. I actually had a mentee that I was chatting with the other day, and while we were chatting, he's like, "Oh, I just got another email where they're asking me to build another company's asking me to build another take home assignment." And I said, well, why don't you do this instead? Send them a message and say, I'm actively interviewing with 3 other companies. They've also asked me to do something very similar to this. Here are my GitHub repos of where I've put that work. Would you consider that instead of me building out another whole application? And I said, the worst they'll say is no. But when I did that on my own job hunt back in December and January, companies were totally open to like, oh, you literally just did this like a week ago. Okay, this is recent experience. We can look through the commit history and see what you built and so on. And every company that I did that with back in my own job hunt, they're like, yeah, okay, that's fine. Like you just did the work. That's okay.
yeah,
And so I told my mentees, like, go do that as well. If companies are asking you, like, if you're interviewing at a whole bunch of companies and they're all asking you to do some sort of take home assignment, build like 1 or 2 of them and then just ask and say, hey, I just did a couple of these. Like, can you review this code and see if that's adequate for what you're looking for? If you need me to add like a little something on one of those projects, I'm willing to do that. But I don't want to start like a whole 20-hour project just for your interview process. And I said, don't word it that way because you don't want to make it sound like you're not willing to do the work. But as part of the interview process, I think we still have a little bit of clout when it comes to like,
yeah,
hey, you know what? Like I'm actively interviewing. I've just done a bunch of this. Like, please consider the following repos as recent work that I've done. And so he said
I
he was
think
going to try
that's
it. He was going to reach out to companies and see what they said.
yeah, I think that's excellent advice. Something I hadn't considered before, but yeah, I mean certainly because, and if you look at it from the perspective of the company that's trying to hire you, right? As interviewees, uh, we do have leverage because it's difficult to find good candidates, and when you do find a good candidate, you want them to join you. And so, if the purpose of a take-home exercise is to just sort of judge how good you are at how good you will be at your job, yeah, any recent, it might even be a recent project that you've made, right? That might even work instead of a take-home exercise. Like, here's something I did a month
Yeah.
ago.
Right.
It could be even a larger project than what they have as an exercise. But yeah, no,
Yeah.
that totally on
Yeah.
board with them.
We've had some good comments in chat about like leak code is good if you don't have a degree, and other people are like maybe companies don't want you sharing projects online. I think a lot of companies, at least here in America, they're okay with like here's the sample app, and it. I mean, if it's just a basic simple CRUD app, it's not really a big deal. But V Whiskey in chat brings up a good point that people will cheat, and yes, they will, but this is also only one portion of the interview. It's
Yeah.
like that take home assignment is not the only thing that we're going to make you do. Like, there's still going to be like active, viewable demonstration of your skill as part of the interview process. But oftentimes, this is like an initial stage, kind of like
Yeah.
what Jibran was saying. Like, this is kind of the entry into like can we weed out like a certain number of people to get to where we find like the most qualified people. And if you happen to make it through that first stage because you've copied someone else's code or whatever, and you make it to that stage, you're going to fall flat anyway when it comes time to actually demonstrate your skills. So it's not a big deal for us as a company. We're still going to disqualify you because yes, we're still going to find people that are cheating. And I actually had that happen when I was at SendGrid. I had a guy come in, I gave him a take-home assignment, and he turned it in, and it was great. So I brought him into the interview process, and I said, "Hey, I found some bugs I want you to fix, and I want you to add this new feature on that code that you wrote." And he got kind of this look like, "Oh no," because he didn't write the code. He had his friend write the code. And I'm like, "What was your hope like to get through our interview process if you didn't actually write that code yourself? Like, how are you going to manage on the job on day 1 where you're seeing a bunch of code that you don't know?" To be able to go in and write a feature, because even the code that his friend wrote, he still didn't know how to go in and like find and locate a bug, fix a bug, or how to add a feature onto existing code that he had never seen before. I'm like, well, this is day 1 at every job. Like, how are you going to go get any job if you can't read through code and locate a bug? So I gave him a little bit of coaching and kicked him out. I'm like, see ya, interview's over. Like, thanks for coming in and wasting my time. I didn't say that, but like it's a huge waste of time when that happens. But we can, like, there's still enough stages along the way that we can still weed those people out, for sure.
Agreed. Yeah, completely. I mean, even lead code. I've seen this. One of the reasons I think lead code and lead code style interviews are also popular in very small startups is the founders can sort of offload the responsibility. If they're not
Mm.
technical developers, it's difficult for them to sort of gauge someone's competence in a one-on-one interview. And so what they do is they say, okay, let's send them a lead code style interview on a bunch of these platforms that now exist, and they use that as the only measure of programming ability, which
Mm.
is also why I think, uh, there are practical reasons why questions of the lead code style and all of these platforms that automate that are popular. I don't always agree with them, but I understand why they're there. Though. So
Mm.
it always it is a good skill set to have the ability to solve. I think those style of interview problems, because it gets you in the door, right?
Yeah.
And sure, it would be better if things were different and you can bring that change once you're hiring. But yeah, as I think a junior developer and an entry level developer, I think it would practicing those styles of interviews would be good, because chances are you're going to end up hitting a requirement for that at
Mm.
one of the companies that you're interviewing for, because few companies, I think the percentage of companies that don't do lead code style interviews is quite low these days, and it's lucky if you find them. But if you don't, and this is the advice I'm giving as sort of to the entry level candidates, it would be beneficial to sort of just go through and get good at those lead code style interviews.
Yeah, I don't think it's going away anytime soon. But yeah, hopefully you're finding companies that are starting to, at least adapt their interview process to not just be leak code. I think kind of going back to your thing about like, why do startups ask leak code, and I agree that to some degree it offloads, that responsibility. But I think at the same time, a lot of companies don't train their interviewers, and they say like, "Hey, Ian, Jibran's coming in for an interview. Go give him a technical interview." It's like, okay, I don't know how to interview somebody, so I'm gonna do the same kind of technical interview I had, and I had to do leak code, so I'm just gonna go get a question off of leak code, and I'll give that to Jibran, see if Jibran can work through it. And that's not necessarily, a good indication of whether that person's a good hire. Like, aside from, do I like working with them? Are they, personable? Are we going to get along okay? Um, so yeah, I think that that's a big factor in there too.
Yeah, definitely agreed. It takes a lot of effort to build a good recruitment process, and a good interview process is part of that. And I think most companies just sort of wing it, in a
Hmm.
sense, like just have someone on the team say go, and I worked at companies that did that. Like they would pick up developer at random and say, we need to interview this person, please go ahead and do it and come
Right.
back to us. And what uh, what that does is it it introduces a lot of bias in the system, I think. If you don't tell them what specifically to look for in a
Right.
good candidate, what they come back, what I've done in the past, uh, is I've gone back with my impressions of, uh, sure, I mean, the thing is, you get two candidates who are both equally good at their job, uh, equally good at the problems that you sort of gave them. And so then it comes down to biases. Whereas if you have a more systematic way of approaching interviews, and you have more systematic questions, and then
Mhm.
a basis for sort of scoring the answers, that leads to a much better outcome. But it also takes a lot more effort, which is why
Yeah.
it's not something a lot of startups dedicate time to.
Yeah. We had another question in chat. What indicators do you look for when interviewing a candidate for technical and non-technical skill?
Uh, so I mean, uh, so I can tell you what I've done in the past, uh, before Stripe, right? And the indicators I was looking for, well, first of all, was essentially basic programming ability, and this comes down to being able to sort of translate a small problem into code, right? At some point, I think Fizzbuzz got really popular. I'm sorry to say, I used that as well in a couple of my interviews. I try not to do that now, but yeah, I got swept for the way at that point. But uh, it was a generally good screening question before it got viral. It was a good screening question because I saw there were a bunch of candidates that could not solve Fizzbuzz, and
Hmm.
it's it tests a very basic ability, right? To translate some a quick requirement into code, and then think about any bugs that you find there. So that's one thing, but that's just something to get your foot in the door. Essentially, that doesn't really determine anything else. Uh, Beyond that, I believe what I've looked for is the ability to sort of build a mental map of the application that you want to have, or sort of translate the problem into a kind of architecture of the application, right? So you have the ability to sort of discuss and uh, uh, essentially talk about the kind of solution you would build. Because uh, I would give them a problem of saying, let's say I want to build a system that manages someone's expenses, right? Like how do you think about that? How do you decompose that into different modules? And that then tells you uh, how to think about problems like this. And again, this is at different levels of interviewing, sort of different levels of the seniority, the problems would get difficult. But that's the basic thing that you're looking for. If they have the ability to take a problem and then sort of start figuring out uh, how to break it down into its smaller problems and solve that, and uh, just the general ability to discuss that with someone, to sort of have a back and forth with, let's say, the interviewer, and make sure they're able to communicate well. Because one of the things I've learned recently after having worked at Stripe is essentially that good communication is really is uh, a huge factor in how good of a software developer you can be. If you're able to sort of work well with others, if you're able to communicate your ideas to others in your team, that's essentially what they call a force multiplier, right? And
Yeah.
I believe that really impacts. So that's the other thing that I would look at. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah,
I may have
no, it's
gone
good.
off a bit there.
Yeah, no, it was great. So like the definitely on the problem solving side, on the communication side, those are all important. Plus, just can you code? I mean, that's going to be a big part of what we screen for. Also had some stuff come through in chat, like team fit is really important. Is the candidate going to thrive in the kinds of teams that we have at the company? I also think like teachability is important. Like, can
Yeah,
I teach you something? Can you teach me something? Like, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got to like have some weird esoteric piece of knowledge that nobody else knows, but can you explain something in a way that and I especially look for this in more like intermediate and senior level developers. Like, if I were a junior dev, could you coach me on something? Because that's part of what I want. When I hire you on my team, I want you to level up everybody else around me. I want you to make my whole team better. Like, yes, you're going to come in, you're going to contribute, but I also want to know that you're willing to share your ideas, but that you're also open to hearing other people's ideas and trying them out and incorporating them, that you're not closed-minded on this is how I know to do a thing and this is the only way I know how to do a thing. And so I might throw a challenge in the interview around like, okay, well you did it that way, but what about this kind of approach? Like, what about this aspect? Like, tell me a use case where you would not do this particular algorithm, just to see if they're open to the idea of, well, yeah, I guess I could have done this, other algorithm like a backtracking algorithm. Like, oh yeah, I guess I didn't have to do a depth first search. Maybe I could have done a breadth first search, or do a more iterative approach if I wanted to be more careful. Like, are they open to those ideas? Or are they just like, no, this is the way to solve it. This is the way to do it. It's like, okay, well, you're not going to get hired on my team. I want to make sure that you're not so strongly opinionated that you're not open to the idea of, potential, other alternative.
yeah. I mean, I've done similar things in the past, and I would sum it up as just not hiring arrogant people. I think that's
Hmm.
a arrogance is a huge red flag in any team,
Yeah.
and I've I've had the opportunity to work with people who I would not hire just based on that, and it's not a great experience for the team as a whole. It just sort of, even if they're like a 10x rockstar coder, right? They just bring down the rest of the team, and I don't believe it's worth it.
Yeah. And Fool says in chat, like, clean code is the only way, like, in quotes, like, if that's kind of their attitude, like, that's not who you want to hire on the team. And, I've seen a lot of people write really clever code and say, like, clever code is better than readable code. It's like, well, you're not the only one maintaining that code. And if somebody else can't figure out what it was you were doing by trying to be clever, then I'm not going to maintain that code. And now it turns into technical debt and nobody else wants to touch that code. And you might think for a minute that that's job security, but really that's me wanting to replace you on the team because you write code that other people can't maintain. Um, yes, there is opportunity for we need this highly optimized, so don't change it and don't try to make it readable. I actually had that happen at a previous job where somebody had written some code. Someone went in and optimized the code so it ran 10 times faster kind of thing. And someone else went in and go, well, I don't understand what this does. And they rewrote it back into something that was more readable and it made it 10 times slower. And other people are like, what just happened to our system? Like, it used to be really fast on this area and now it's this huge bottleneck. And they went in and realized that somebody didn't understand what the clever code was doing, and so they unoptimized it to make it readable. So yes, there are times and places to have highly optimized code, but put some comments around explaining what it's doing and say, don't change this. This is the most optimal way to do this, even though it's not readable. This is what it's doing. Like
Yeah.
that's a good use case for putting comments in your code of like, please don't touch this. This has been vetted, it's been tested, like this is the optimal way that we really want to do this. Please don't change this piece of code. So there are times and places to have optimized, clever looking code that is harder to read, because sometimes readability and optimization don't play well together. Sometimes it's definitely a one or the other kind of scenario.
But I totally agree. But even then, like you said, right? It's if you are a great developer, you will then go ahead and take the time to comment on why you've done what you've done and how you've done it, because good and that you're not going to spend your entire life working on that one product or on that one piece of code, and someone else is going to have to come in and take over your work at some point, right? And just not realizing that is kind of
Yeah, for sure. So when you were interviewing at Stripe, what kinds of things about your background? Like I know you kind of joked a little bit, but I don't know that it was purely luck anymore at this point. I mean, you've been in the industry for 10 plus years. I don't think it's necessarily luck that's getting you these jobs anymore. I think it's definitely the skills that you've been building up over time. What would you say, like in your own application when you applied at Stripe? What do you think really stood out to them, or what did you sort of do or pursue on purpose to sort of get noticed by Stripe and get into their interview process?
I don't know if I have a good answer to that, because again, I didn't do anything specifically to get noticed by Stripe, and that was because I didn't even know Stripe was an option back then when I was interviewing. Because I saw their job post on LinkedIn that they were hiring in Dubai by almost pure chance. So I don't know if I did anything to prepare specifically for Stripe, or and I can't say what stood out to them, but I think I can take a guess at what stood out to some of, in general, from my profile, from the work that I've done, the experience that I've gained. And I think it's something that I've tried to do for the past 6 or 7 years of my career is to get closer to the product development side of things and to figure out how the business side of things work, because one thing I've sort of seen change in myself as I've grown from a junior engineer to a senior engineer, and as I've worked in different companies, is I used to have, I used to think that coding was the only thing that I should know and be good at, and if you were able to write or code up a great application, you would be able to sort of have a great business around it. And what I've seen is there are many businesses that run on code that is honestly not great, and yet the business itself is still doing very well. And so good code or great code is no indicator of a good or a great business. You can have amazing written code, and that doesn't lead to a business doing very well. And so I've started to learn that a differentiator is sort of the product side of things, on how you use your ability to program computers to solve people's problems. And that's essentially what, to me, product development is, right? Product management, as some would call it. And I think that's one of the things that I've been focusing on a lot over the past few years of my career. And I think that might have been something that stood out in the different conversations I've had with interviewers over the past year essentially when I was looking for a new role. And so I think that's one of the things I also tell anyone who sort of asks me for advice on how to move up in their careers is to stop thinking about code as the only thing or even the most important thing. Because honestly, I don't think the code that you write is the most important thing. It's the problem that it solves that is going to be the most important thing that you're going to essentially output. Your output is not code, right? That's just a tool. Your output is the problem that you're solving for other people, and that's the thing you should really get good at identifying. Like, what is it that you're really solving? What problem you're helping people with, and then you should really get really good at figuring out what ways are there to solve that problem well. And the code is, I mean, like I said, the reason I joke that all startups are just CRUD interfaces on top of a database is because most of them are, right? There's some business logic there, but most of, I mean, even if you look at some of the most successful startups, right? A lot of them are just nicer interfaces on top of a database structure some way. And the reason for that is that that's what solved the customer's problem, and that's what customers paid money for. And yeah, so that's something I've always, over the past few years, I've advised people on. Like, look beyond the code. The code is just a tool. And nowadays, if you look at all of this no code movement that's happening, right? There are people who are building businesses and selling them for hundreds of thousands of dollars based purely on these no code tools. And that just goes to show you that, again, the code itself is not the objective. It's the objective is the problem that you're solving. And
Yep.
so if you get good at identifying the problems and how to solve them, I think you're just going to stand out
Yeah.
as a good engineer.
That's one reason that I recommend when you're building a resume or a CV and you're listing out your projects. One of the things you need to put on there is some sort of user empathy statement of like, what does the user do with this? Because it's one thing to say, oh, I built this in Rails, or I built this in Django, or I built this using React or whatever. It's like, okay, that's fine, but like, what problem does this actually solve? Like, can you think about it from the end user's perspective on why did you build this in the first place? Like, what does this actually solve? And so yeah, I agree with that sentiment. I think understanding why we do something is more important than how we do something, because the how is always going to change. There's always going to be some new language, there's always going to be some new framework, there's going to be some new methodology on how to like actually go build the thing. The real question is why. Like, why are we doing the thing? And if you don't understand the why, then the how doesn't matter.
Yep.
So yeah, I agree with that. I think that that's good. And Fool actually says in chat, I think it's an entry level dev. I think it's okay to be a bit code focused. You need to be able to build the code crafting skill. Once you're good enough, though, you're more valuable if you know how to solve the right problems. And I absolutely agree with that. I think that that's a fantastic way to think about it too. Like early in your career, just focus on the code. Maybe don't worry
Yep.
too much about like why are we building it this way. I mean, having those questions is a good idea. But I think to get your foot in the door, you need to be able to say like, "Hey, point me in the right direction. I'm going to go get the work done." And then over time, be able to say like, but why are we doing that? Like, is there a better way to accomplish this, or have we thought about this or that? And like, definitely come in with your own perspectives. And you can do that right from the get go as well. But I think that's an interesting way to think about it too.
Yeah, no, completely agreed. I would, yeah, I mean, my advice on thinking about outside of code and thinking about the problem that it's solving, I would not give that to an entry level engineer. Because the problem with an entry level, if I give that advice to someone who's an entry level engineer, is they just don't have the experience. Like, you can learn to code on your own. There are tons of tutorials out there that can teach you how to build something. I don't know if there are as good resources on product management or product development, because most of the people I've seen that are good product managers or good product developers are people that have sort of gone through the, I mean, essentially just gone from like a junior position, learn from people who are above them, and then sort of gained experience that way. Because it's difficult to gain experience on what a good product is unless you've done it. Whereas programming is something that I think is unique, but also something luckily that you can get good at even by yourself, right? Without going out and talking to others. There's a very quick feedback loop there. You build something, it works, great. And even for larger scale projects, like you can build something and work on it for 1 year, and then you can learn a bunch of stuff about how what architecture decisions you made at the start of the project, how they've affected it long term. But whereas with product development, you have to go out and talk to your users, get feedback, which is difficult to do if you're like just starting out as a junior. So, yeah, 100%. As an entry level or a junior engineer, just focus on the job, your primary job, which is coding, but then also use that time to learn, to work with the product managers in your team, and to sort of gain that knowledge of what makes a good product, why do they take the decisions that they take, and more importantly, how do they figure out what the right decisions are, because a lot of that comes down to measuring data about user behaviors, and I think it's very important to sort of
Yeah.
understand how to measure that and then what to do with the data once you have it.
Yeah, that's good. Had another question, a series of questions in chat. What approaches have you seen entry-level candidates do that have succeeded? Sorry, let me reword this. What approaches have you seen entry-level candidates that have succeeded? What approaches have they taken to get more experience? For example, get a job at a startup or start in some other kind of role like QA. Does it just come down to building a strong portfolio on a site like GitHub?
So I think the last thing that they mentioned, a strong portfolio on GitHub, is something that I would say generally stands out. Even to this day, someone with a strong GitHub portfolio is you don't come across developers as often, especially junior entry level engineers. It's not often that entry level engineers have a good GitHub portfolio. So that's one thing that immediately would stand out to an interviewer. Sorry, what was the first two things?
So they were asking what approaches, like people that have been successful as entry level developers, like what sort of approaches help them get more experience? For example, like should they go work at a startup or go into some other kind of role, like a QA role?
Nice. So I would not. I mean, I've never actually advised anyone to go into QA roles. If you want to go into software development, there's a lot of overlap between the two. But I think what usually ends up happening is you sort of box yourself into the role that you start out with, and it's difficult to change down the line. And it's unfair, but that's the way it is today, where you gain 3 years of experience as a QA engineer, and then you want to shift into just pure software development, and then it's probably tougher because the interviewer sees you as someone who's coming with 3 years of experience in one particular side of software development, and then you want to shift into something else. So it's I've never actually advised that. I don't know if that would work. I've seen people do it. I've seen people go from QA engineers to software development, but I've seen it be more difficult than it would be as an entry level engineer. Because
I think
the
though,
more experience
as a counterpoint on that though, I think if you can tell a good story as to why that made you a better developer for this next role, like you could say, like, I went into QA, I specifically wanted to do it for 1 year so that I had a better idea around strong testing and automation and that user's perspective. And now that I've done that, it's going to make me an even better developer for this other particular kind of role where I want to focus on this other aspect. And if you can kind of build up those projects to show that you could do that other kind of work and tell the story about why that made you a better developer for that other role, I think it comes down to how you tell that story.
Agreed. Yeah. No. I mean, if you can show how your experience as a QA developer is going to make you a much better software engineer. I mean, QA developers are software engineers, so a software developer, let's say, a different role, then certainly that's going to be very useful. On the other question about working at startups, so just a, I mean, I believe the most knowledge I've gained in my career has been working at startups because you get to put on so many hats, and all of the knowledge that I've just talked about around product development and how business works, and all of that came from the startup that I spent, like let's say, the past 5 years at, and one startup before that. So working in a startup is a tremendous opportunity to just learn. Uh, One thing, although, I would caution against, which I've seen in one instance, is a startup or a company that's starting a new project that's only hiring mid-level or junior engineers. The Now I've only seen that once, so I don't know if that's common. Uh, but the problem with that is, as a junior engineer, you need other more experienced people to learn from, to catch
Agreed.
your mistakes, to suggest better approaches to what you're doing. And if you're only on a team that has junior or even, let's say, mid-level engineers but no senior engineers, you don't get that opportunity. And I've seen that firsthand. I mean, for myself, when I first joined essentially Dubiza, which was my first professional software development job here in Dubai. I honestly came into it thinking I knew how to code, and I did at some extent, but there was so much I was doing either incorrectly or just ineffectively, and that was quickly. I sort of quickly got over that because there were senior software developers on my team that would point out these mistakes to me in, let's say, code reviews and uh, pairing sessions and all that, and I could just ask them for questions on how to solve a problem more effectively. And so that's just one thing I would look out for. But yeah, otherwise, startups are probably the best place to learn and to learn very quickly.
Yeah. I've mostly worked at startups in my career, and yeah, I agree with that. It's a great place to learn, but it can be pretty intimidating for entry level developers, like you say, without that mentorship. But it can also be really hard for an entry level developer in a startup because most startups want to work very quickly, very fast. They expect that everybody's going to put in like a lot of effort, usually after hours. Like it can be a lot of pressure to try to get things done. Or, even if they have senior developers on the team, those senior developers might be too busy to give you as much mentorship as you need. And so I think startups are a good place for entry level developers if you have very strong initiative and you can go learn on your own very well and quickly, and then like build on that knowledge. Not everybody thrives in that kind of scenario, though. Some people really thrive on having more of that mentorship. And so in those scenarios, if you can identify that about yourself, that can help you identify like what kinds of companies should you be applying to. And I would generally caution, like, if that's not you, don't go work at startups early in your career. Later, yeah, absolutely, I think that's fine. We had another good follow-up question, like what counts as a strong GitHub portfolio? Like what kinds of projects would you want to see on GitHub that you would consider to be like a strong portfolio?
That would, I mean, personally, that would vary from role to role, right? Like if I'm hiring someone uh, as a database administrator, right, which I've never done, so I don't know what goes into that, but just an example. I would look at projects that sort of speak to their skills in that area, right? If I'm hiring someone to build a simple CRUD application in, let's say, Ruby on Rails and Django, then I would look at projects that speak to that. Uh, what I think helps the most, though, is even if you build something simple, uh, have a clear vision of why you're building it. Like there are 50,000 to-do list applications out there, right? And if you just build another one, it doesn't really say anything except that you know how to follow a tutorial.
Right.
But if you have an idea of a to-do list that can solve a particular problem that you have that no other app is solving, right? That's product development, right? And if you can do that, if you can say this is the thing that I'm looking to solve, and this is the approach that I've taken. Because then what that shows is that you're able to go from a problem to a solution without needing someone to hold your hand all of the way.
Yeah.
Right? You can solve problems without uh, hand holding required from zero
Yeah.
to end. So I think that's something very important. Like, and then the other thing I would suggest is, and this goes beyond GitHub, if it's possible, and I think there are a lot of free resources available these days. To just deploy your application somewhere as well. Have it running uh, live somewhere, right? That just
Yeah.
really shows, because that gives you a different kind of skill set.
It does, for sure.
But beyond that, it also increases the understanding of how the workflow is, what the workflow is in organizations where developers write code and then it gets deployed to somewhere. Just having a high level overview of that also helps. But yeah, so I think what stands out would be different from role to role, but something that solves a real problem that you've identified and then solves it in some way, and then you've written code that solves that problem in some way, I think goes a long way. And
One
then
thing
the
I,
other thing,
oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
no, please go ahead. I have
Uh,
something about CVs, but we can come back to that later.
okay. So one thing that that I often coach people on when they're like, what kinds of projects should I build? I usually try to bring them back to the idea on like, why did you become a software developer? Like, what did you envision doing that got you interested in writing software in the first place? Go build a project about that, because it shows kind of your interest, but also like why you got into the industry in the first place. Because it can be really hard sometimes to just tell somebody like, yeah, just go solve a real problem in the world. It's like, well, you can't solve everything with software, but there are interesting things that you could try to go solve. But like you say, there are a lot of to-do list applications out there, but a lot of people are like, well, what's something that I face? Like my day on a Sunday is, okay, I'm going to go build my shopping list of I need fruit and pizzas and cucumbers and carrots and green onions. And it's like, I need some sort of application to keep track of my shopping list. It's like, yeah, there's a billion of those out there in the world too. That's not really solving something novel, but it solved it for me. And so again, I think it comes down to how you tell the story about it a little bit. When I think of like what makes a good GitHub project portfolio, I like to think of like what kinds of like tangible skills are going to be helpful across the board, like at a lot of different jobs. And I think I tweeted recently about like, go build an application that has like the following things built into it, like authorization, authentication, like, you know, build like a little portfolio, like where you can log in, you can build a like a profile page for yourself where you upload a profile picture, and then you can go view other people's profiles. And if you're logged in, you see a little more detail, but if you're not logged in, you see a limited amount of detail. And if you're logged in and you go to your own profile, you can edit your own profile. That covers a really wide gamut of overall technical skill between database and CRUD, but also authorization of what are you allowed to do on specific pages based on who you are, and session management and things like that. Those are pretty critical skills that are going to be widely used across everything. And then from there, use that as a framework to go build your shopping list app or your to-do list app or whatever. Like, it'll just show like you can add all these other sort of components. But I think too, like, you don't have to go build 50 different projects. Go build like one big project. Now that you're logged in, you've got your shopping list, or you've got your, you know, to-do list, or you've got, you know, whatever other problem, but it's all kind of in this one same application. And I really like the idea that you had of like, go deploy it somewhere. Because when I think of what stands out on a resume, especially like, should I call this person, is if you can give me a link to where I can go see the project that you built and not just go stare at code on GitHub. Because I can, like, when I pull up GitHub, I'm going to like look through your README and go, okay, you've got some code here. I'm not going to go through and read every line of code to know, like, I might look through some of your commit history at best. But if I can click on a link and actually go see the application that you built and go see, like, what is your, you know, what kind of layout did you use? Like, is it, you know, the page that I land on? Like, do you tell me what this app is even about? or do I have to immediately log in first and then get to do something? Like that makes a big difference on my experience for whether I should even call you. So kind of tying this back around, and then I'll hand it off to you for about CVs and resumes. I like to see that live link as well. And I think spending a couple of minutes figuring out like, can I get this on Netlify or Heroku or like some of these free platforms where you can go host these projects, I think goes a long way as well. Not just from the experience of I know how to deploy something, because a true production application is going to be far more complicated than just pushing a little bit of code to GitHub or to Heroku. But I think from the experience point of view of like, I get to go tangibly experience what you've built as a potential hiring manager or recruiter. That's way more powerful.
Totally agree.
You were going to share some thoughts on CVs as well.
Yes, I mean, just one thing, one point I've seen in a lot of CVs that I've had to review over the years is people often list out the jobs that they've worked on, the technologies that they've used, and that's all great to sort of filter out people that can really work well for the role that you have. If you want a Java developer, you need someone who's worked with Java, right? But there's like 500 people who work with Java. What I think helps developers really stand out is listing the projects that they've built, and then specifically talking about what parts they've done in those projects. So that's one thing I've seen people put in the CVs, which makes it stand out. The other thing which you can do is going to have an amazing impact. I believe at least it had for me when I was reviewing CVs, is sharing actual numbers on the impact that you had. Right, I solved this problem. It reduced our bill on AWS by 500,000 a year. I solved this. I built this project. By the time I left, it was being used by 500 users, bringing in 50,000 K a year, stuff like that. If you're able to share those numbers, that just really separates you from the pack. But even if you don't have those numbers, if you can, you should certainly put in details of the projects that you worked in on your previous jobs, and specifically what your role was, because that just gives you more confidence in who I'm going to sort of bring into an interview. But then the other thing it gives you is sort of an unfair advantage, where if you've listed out the things that you've done and you've worked on, then the interview is going to focus on those. They will talk to you about those things, because that's a lot of the times what interviewers are doing is just scanning through your CV and looking at things to pick off and ask you questions about, right? In places that don't have a very formal interview process, I've seen that happen a lot. And if you're able to sort of seed your CV with specific things that you want to talk about, projects that you think you've done very well on, that gives you the advantage where the interview will focus on those things, and you can then just sort of just do very well on the interview.
How likely is it though that someone's got those kinds of tangible numbers, like especially an entry level developer? Like you're not going to have built anything that's bringing in 500,000 a year, but like I think you could still talk about some amount of impact that you've had. Like, you know, I wrote these tests and it reduced our bugs by 10%, or you know, I changed this bit of code, like, and it sped up this part. Like I found a bottleneck in my code and it sped it up by 15 times or something like that. Like you can still share those kinds of impacts even as an entry level developer.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to preface that this is not specifically for entry level. This is mostly for people who sort of looking for their third or fourth role, who have some experience under their belt. But yeah, as an entry level developer, you probably won't have this. But for that, all of the device that Ian shared about, GitHub portfolio, stuff like that, that would be much more applicable.
Fool also mentioned in chat, I think even personal growth you could list as impact to some degree, but when I think of impact on a CV, as a hiring manager, when I'm looking at that CV, I want to know that you can come and have that impact on my team here. So personal growth isn't as important as how are you going to make my company better? How are you going to make my team better? Yes, I still want you to go learn and grow professionally as an individual, but I want to know like how are you going to bring that to my team? And so personal growth as an impact statement, I think is okay. Like I learned 2 new programming languages over the past couple of years. Like that's fine. But how does that help me? Like it's good to see that you're growing and so on, but like how does that impact my bottom line? Like how is that making my team better? It's like, yes, you're continuing to grow, but unless you can turn around and say like, I implemented like an internal, learning kind of session where we would teach each other these things, and I improved our team's productivity by 5% because of that. Like, there is growth, but how does it help me? Like, yes, I want to see that you're continuing to grow and progress in your own career, but at the end of the day, I'm interviewing you because I see something on your CV that I want you to do at my company. So I'd be curious, like, what kind of personal growth impact you would put on a CV, to try to sort of be enticing from there. Says I think it might. Just looking through Fool's follow up. I think I started reading lots of help, but now I can drive myself, or I can drive small to medium sized projects. Sure. As entry level, you might say you might not have that to show. So I think it might give younger people a bit of imposter syndrome of like, oh, I need to show revenue of several million to even be considered. Yeah, exactly. So you don't want to be kind of that gatekeeper of like, oh, you're not a developer unless you've saved a company $1 million, or you're not a developer unless you've made something 10 times faster. It's like, no, it's not. That's not at all what we're saying. What we're saying is later in your career, you will actually have tangible things like this. Like I was part of a project that made the company millions of dollars, or I was part of a project that helped reduce blah, blah, blah. And being able to show that impact for that next job. But as an entry level developer, that is much harder to kind of quantify that impact. But I think that there are still ways, even as an entry level developer, that you can show that impact, whether it's I reduced my bug count by 10% over the course of a week, or I was able to use a profiler. Like I wanted my code to be a little bit faster, so I learned how to use a profiler to find bottlenecks in my code, and as a result, my code was 53% faster. Profiling tools will show you those timings, and so you can actually come up with real percentages on those kinds of things. But that doesn't mean you have to go, learn how to use a profiler in order to do that. What we're saying is that by showing that impact, it does stand out more. But I think just having those projects and talking about like the problem that you solved and so on, as an entry level developer, that's often enough. What we're saying is later in your career, being able to show that impact is a much faster way of sort of getting into those interviews.
One more thing I would sort of add is, as an entry level developer, and this is what worked for me. So this is just anecdotal evidence, sample size of 1, but I was really focused on one technology, particularly Python and Django, and that's what my profile was built around when I got my first interview and my first role. And I think it helps because if you're looking to hire an entry level developer for one particular role that you have, someone who has 3 or 4 projects to show in one technology versus someone who's done like let's say 5 different technologies. The person who's done 5 things in 5 technologies show that they can learn very quickly, but the person who's done 5 projects in the same technology, what that tells me is they know a lot more about specifically that thing, right? They know a lot more about Python, and then it becomes much easier for me to onboard them onto the project that I'm working on because they already have a lot of the experience that. So that's one thing, and another thing, if you're and this is specifically for the kind of startups that I worked in, which is essentially web applications. So what you would call Web 2.0 startups. If you're goal is to get a job in a web application develop web application startup, like what we would call Web 2 startups, Web 2.0, and at ones that are really early in their journey. I think it helps to have some full stack skills if you're able to build both the back end and some of the front end, because at a startup you're going to be wearing different hats, and sometimes you might need to work on the front end, even if you're a back end engineer. That's been the case for me as well. Uh, Personally, I am a back end focused software developer. I've worked with Django for like 10 years now, but I have enough front end skills to just make something appear on the web page. Doesn't look pretty,
Very much the same way.
just has to work. And I think if you can show that you're like a semi full stack developer, even as a entry level candidate, which you can, there are amazing tutorials out there that will walk you through the entire stack. Uh, that also just sort of adds a lot more, yeah, to your
Yeah,
resume.
I agree. Like having multiple projects in a smaller amount of tech stack, I think does show kind of that depth of knowledge, and that's something that I talk about too as advice. Is like, especially early in your career, don't try to go learn too many things. Go deeper on fewer things, and it's something that we kind of call being a T-shaped engineer, where you can learn a little bit, but go really deep on like one thing, like go really deep on one tech stack, because that shows us that you've experienced more about that particular technology than building a to-do list app. And I've said this on the stream too, like if all you do is go build a to-do list tutorial in 50 different tech stacks, that's all you know how to do is build a to-do list. If I give you a stronger challenge of something that you've never done before, you're going to fail, and you're going to, well, not fail, but you're going to have a harder time implementing that because you haven't thought through those kinds of problems before. Like, yeah, you can go build a to-do list app, but if I ask you to build authentication, or if I ask you to build session management or whatever, like, you might not have an understanding of how to do that because you've never done it before. And so you're going to feel very comfortable going and doing that to-do list application, but you're not going to be as comfortable, doing something outside of the bounds of that. And one of the things that I've talked about in the past was the idea of like online games. Like when I play an online game, you get really comfortable at those early levels, especially like an MMO, right? Like you play World of Warcraft or something, and you get really comfortable being around like those home cities because it's safe and you know how to run back to the guard, if the, evil rats are like coming after you or whatever. But like it starts getting scarier to like progress and explore out in the world. You always tend to like, oh, I'm going to just go start a new character because it's comfortable being around that home base. And it's going to feel that same way with technology too, where as you build out certain kinds of projects, you're going to feel very comfortable doing that sort of thing. But I think that expansion and exploration and growth is important to have. I think that you shouldn't shy away from it, but I think again that it really shows more of that depth of what you're trying to do than just doing the same thing over and over and over again. Now, that said, the other advice I would tend to give is if you've solved a problem around authentication in, say, Django, and a company wants you to go learn Rails, then go rebuild that same project in Rails, because you already know how to solve the problem. Now you just have to figure out how to do it in this other technology instead. And so, yeah, I like the idea of like do more projects in fewer technologies. I think that showing that depth will be really important. Let's see. We had another question in chat. Does big data require math and statistics? I mean, generally, sometimes, but not always. What are your thoughts on big data? Because I've got two ways to think about big data and like data lakes and data warehousing and stuff like that. Have you had experience working in big data?
Uh, well, no, I can't really say anything. the only thing I would say is requiring a good knowledge of maths isn't necessary for big data, because big data is two things, right? One is storing the data, making sure it's something that can be accessed and all that. Then the other is actually analyzing it, right? So if you're on the team that sort of, which would be the what you could call the infrastructure team, right? You really don't care what the data looks like and how you need to analyze it. So on that side, you wouldn't need a lot of mathematics. But if you're on the data science team, is what mostly companies call them, then yes, certainly mathematics is going to be the main thing your skills are based on.
I think the other thing with big data is a lot of like, I would say probably 5 to 10 years ago, like big data was, the kind of the buzzword of the day. It's like, oh, we have a big data problem. It's like, well, is it a data problem that's big, or is it legitimately like what we would consider big data as a problem? And so there's two different ways of thinking about it. If you've just got a data problem, like how do we crunch all of this data, and we've got so much data that it's a problem, then you have a big data problem. But if it's, hey, how do we actually crunch this and get useful analytic data out of it, that's a big data problem. And so like kind of you can kind of put a pause in between two of the words, is like, is it a large problem with data, or is it a big data issue that you have to solve? Because they're very different things. But I would agree, like usually just basic algebraic math is really all you need in programming. X equals 5 and y equals 3 and x plus y equals whatever. That's going to be roughly the extent of what you're going to need as far as math skills. Ankit was also asking, how do you look for problems like authentication, session management? I think you could just go build one on your own. Like imagine if you were going to go build like some new social platform, like how would you design your database to store users, use some sort of OAuth, like log in with Google, log in with Twitter, go figure out how to do OAuth. And then the session management from there, like once I'm logged in, what do I do? I think that those all make good building blocks for how to go build other kinds of projects that give you deeper understanding of how the internet in general works. And I think that those make better projects as standout projects on a resume than just, a resume or a recipe card index or an ingredient index or something like that. I think it just gives a better depth or better experience around the depth of knowledge that you have in something. Cool. Jibran, I think we'll start to wrap up. I appreciate your time today. I know it's really late over there in Dubai. It's something like 10 or 10:30 or something like that for you over there. So I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing your perspectives. It's always fun to hear other people's journeys into tech and how you started as a self-taught engineer. You taught yourself programming. You kind of got your way into tech and started building out projects and started building up experience to now you're at one of the most successful companies in the world. Absolutely a journey that others can take. You don't have to go get an engineering degree in computer science in order to get a job. Having any kind of education can be good as long as you can demonstrate the work that you do. Appreciate all the ideas around like building up GitHub portfolios and things to put on a CV, perspectives on what makes good projects and the kinds of things that are important in interviews. Always appreciate your insights and so on as well. So thank you for that. Thank you for spending time with us today. We'll let you hop off the call if you like. Thank you so much for spending time with us today, and hope we can chat again soon.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you for having me, and I hope this helped people.
Yep. Thanks, Jibran.
Thanks
Have a great day. Cheers.
You too.
All right. Well, that was Jibran, senior developer at Stripe, and really appreciate having all these different folks on the stream. It's always really great. And yeah, thanks for all the new folks dropping in and dropping questions as well, and lots of cool follow up in chat as well. Always appreciate folks like Fool dropping their perspectives and ideas and stuff like that. Very, very much appreciated. I got a ton of stuff I got to get done today, so I'm actually going to have to pop off the stream here in a minute. We'll go find somebody that we can raid into, see if anybody else is online that we can go raid into. See if we can maybe find somebody new or somebody that's doing some programming or something like that that we can go do some raid into. Let's see who's online. We got some Lego. 100 devs is going on. Maybe we'll raid in there. Am I making more dragons? No, I'm actually not making more dragons right now. I do need to start producing like what we're going to do as a giveaway for the October giveaway for the fundraiser up here. But I haven't decided yet what that's going to be. I've got one new printer showing up sometime in October. I think it's going to be October. And I've got a new printer kit that's going to be showing up that I have to assemble. So that's going to take some time to actually assemble and build. But I've got 3 other printers that I can do some stuff on. So I just figure out like what it is I'm going to produce, and then from there we'll get those actually built out and get ready for the giveaway. I want to start printing those by mid to late September so that we've got some stuff to give away for the month of October. So yeah, we'll figure that out. I don't know that it's going to be something big like dragons. I'm leaning towards something more flat that will fit in like a stiff envelope, like a stiff cardboard envelope or something that'll be a little bit easier to mail. Although I'm worried about those getting bent, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure yet what we're gonna do there. I might do like some little kit where you just break the pieces apart and you like put together and build a thing. I've seen some really interesting kits like that. Cool. I think. Let's see. Yeah, I think we'll raid over into Leon, and we'll go say hi to folks over there. So let's go set up that raid. We're gonna go raid into Learn with Leon. Cool. We'll see folks over there. Thanks for hanging out today. Again, really appreciate Jibran's time. We'll be back on Thursday, and we'll be doing more Q&A. I did have a couple of resumes come in, so we might do some resume reviews. If you want to get those in, you can absolutely do a resume review. Just send it over to this link, and we'll give that a shot. I'll get all these links in the YouTube description down below. And thanks for hanging out today, folks. We'll catch you over in Leon's channel. Have a great day. If your day is over, have a great night, and we'll see you next stream. Have a good day, everyone.